Hello and welcome to our September third-party roundup webinar with Syxsense. Today, we have our industry expert, John Cassell, here to give us an inside look on the newest third-party patch releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and John will reach out after to answer those. And with that, John Cassell.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending the September third-party webcast. Today, I'll be covering some of the most popular third-party applications that have received updates since the start of September. There have been a number of security bulletins and advisories in the month, and unfortunately, compared to last month, a handful of actively exploited issues that we are going to cover in depth. Last month was a lot of updates dropped, but not really a lot that were, I would say, high priority. This month is definitely going to be different, or it's been different, I should say, since we're looking back in time. For most third-party applications, we actually have no idea when they'll be provided by their vendors. Most manufacturers have no guaranteed release cadence to rely on. However, Microsoft has been using the second Tuesday of the month for well over a decade, and some manufacturers have been following suit, actually, lately, such as Adobe. And I've actually seen a bit of that coming with some others like Chrome and Firefox as well. And I hope they actually do follow suit. It'd be great to know when updates actually drop. But again, nothing that we can really rely on. They can drop an update whenever they want. Or what we'll be looking at today when something critical occurs, such as an out of band and, of course, the 0 days. I also perform this webcast on the last Tuesday of the month, again, just to ensure that I can capture most of the month's releases. We'll actually be doing something a little different today. Something just dropped right before we started the call. I have it handy, but we're going through the release notes a little impromptu for one of the products. Before we jump into it, though, and I go through this kind of spiel every single time, I do want to provide a bit of a precursor in terms of course, what we're prioritizing, some of the terms that we'll be looking at when we're talking about not just patches and updates, but also the vulnerabilities that they are there to solve. And there are other situations as well, mitigations, workarounds that can also take place. Let's briefly discuss what a vulnerability is versus what a patch or an update does. A vulnerability is a bug or misconfiguration in a product, an application, or an operating system that, if exploited, allows the product or system to be compromised by an attacker. A patch or an update is instead a piece of software or code published by the vendor or the manufacturer of that product or system to resolve the vulnerability. With that being said, not all vulnerabilities can be patched, and not all patches resolve vulnerabilities. If a vulnerability exists in a product or a system, but no patch or workaround is available, or if it's dropped same day, then the vulnerability is considered a 0-day exploit. Before we get into those, again, latest updates, how do we prioritize the updates? There are multiple strategies out there, but here at Syxsense, we focus on 6 different factors. The first is going to be your vendor severity. And it typically ranges from critical severity to non-applicable. It can be any kind of scale, any type of metering or rating that they provide. It comes directly, again, from the manufacturer of that update. It's important to always check the vendor severity of any updates. However, do bear in mind that it can clearly be a biased rating. A lot of third-party updates don't receive severities from their manufacturers, as it would highlight that product, obviously, in or application in a negative light. So do take just a bit of caution there because they're not standardized. And we'll look at a few today, like Adobe using a priority system that's flipped upside down, with the higher the number being less severe and the lower the number being more severe. It's not obviously going to translate the same to, say, the CVSS scale, which we'll look at next, or just say some type of classification like important versus recommended versus critical. They're not really comparable. To combat this, we instead prioritize the industry severity more, like mentioned, the CVSS, or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, calculated by an independent organization. This ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe and critical, and ensures that even though we have our vendor severity, which they can say what they want, it does typically correlate with the industry score, but it can be something different. You can have a high severity update from Microsoft, and then Microsoft says critical. Or I should say the opposite. It can go either way, actually. Or you can have a rating from the industry and the vendor says nothing. That's always possible. The higher the rating, though, again, in the CVSS, it typically entails the higher possibility of exploitation. Then we deal with the state of the vulnerability, such as we call it weaponized. It means that it's actively being exploited in the wild and can affect any individual or environment at this exact moment by sophisticated attacks. If, of course, the vulnerability is still outstanding, meaning we haven't done anything to solve it. Then we deal with the state of the vulnerabilities become disclosed. This is where it means the structure of the blueprint of the bug has been exposed to the industry. It doesn't mean that it's currently being exploited, but the details are out there on how to weaponize it. So there may not be proof that actually someone is really doing something about it, but we know how to hack it. We know how to basically compromise those assets. They're typically published by bug bounty programs, independent researchers, sometimes the manufacturer. I mentioned this month after month. We've seen that it can be dropped actually in a briefing at a security conference. It's some type of talk or presentation that somebody may have, because it's, of course, a really good topic. If you have the details on how to exploit something, of course, let's get a huge audience and let's discuss it. And then, of course, articles will come out just after that, specifying how that particular vulnerability can be exploited. Countermeasures are also a possibility and are provided in two ways. Either a mitigation, such as a configuration from antivirus, or an EDR that is hunting and stopping the vulnerability in its tracks without urgently deploying an actual update to the system. And the other countermeasure is a workaround, such as a registry, policy, or service configuration change that also prevents the vulnerability from being exploited. If it's something data related, if it's a setting that's enabled through the registry, maybe we don't have to patch the operating system or the product, but we can just reconfigure the file, remove the attack surface. A great example of this is when Microsoft provides a recommended policy or registry change, which they've done a few times in the past few years, especially this year, just a couple months ago, without the need to actually deploy an update. And Microsoft did do this back in July with a, I think the CVE, I always got on the top of my head, 2023-36884 was regarding an Office and HTML remote code execution issue. They publicly released it in the about early to mid-July. They didn't actually patch it until August, but the workaround was published and provided to customers and consumers alike to make a configuration change before they actually updated the system. Finally, the sixth factor in determining a strategy is the exposure and the breakdown based on whatever tool or solution is being used to detect and report on outstanding vulnerabilities across the fleet. Not a consumer-based tool, obviously here. We're talking about businesses and IT departments that have some type of solution for managing devices on a large scale. Every environment is going to be different and typically includes various versions of operating systems, various deviations of applications and software that exists. Not just looking at every industry, but of course, simply, what does it benefit this particular organization? Are we using a competitor's product versus the next? Of course, the more products we're looking at. Knowing where said vulnerabilities exist allow us to better target the endpoints for that remediation. So let's look at third-party products that have received updates since the month started. And I've mentioned this in the past, the reason I target these particular updates, might see a lot of the same names over and over, whether it's a product you do or don't use, it's because they are all resolving some type of security vulnerability that, again, has been disclosed. Something that we have proof of, or we have an actual status or an update or an article, anything that I can find actually, that I can provide on the webcast today that is security focused. All products mentioned, again, have some sort of advisory, with many receiving alerts actually from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to update as soon as possible. And there are actually a few more that are on that list that I won't be covering today, not that are more, I would say, on the operational technology space. If that happens to be your industry, please always look to CISA for that. I'm not going to mention vendor names, but there are a lot of other products there that might be more specific to your industry. Those I won't be covering today, but for ones that, of course, are going to be cross-industry, like your typical browsers, third-party applications, other than the operating system, that's what we focus on. First, Adobe dropped a few updates for Windows, macOS, and cloud services. This month, they only patched 3 of their products: Adobe Connect, Acrobat and Reader, and Experience Manager. Adobe Connect received an update to simply resolve 2 important issues, both related to cross-site scripting. with a lower CVSS score of only 4.7. Moving on, there is an important detail. This release does have a vendor priority of 3. I want to mention this because it's something I mentioned earlier, actually. When we look at the vendor severity, it can be in their own kind of rating system. So they actually, for Adobe Connect, stamped this with a lower priority, but again, very different. Adobe flipped the model. The higher the number, the less severe, whereas typically we would see the higher the number, the more concerning. So for that priority of 3, it means it's far less likely to be exploited. As again, the more severe, the lower the number. They then patched Acrobat and Reader to resolve a single but critical 0-day vulnerability with a CVSS score of 7.8. And they marked it as critical. So when I say critical, that was the vendor rating. And the CVSS is 7.8, which we typically translate as high. Critical would be anywhere, I would say, probably 9 and above, but it's still a high severity. It's tracked as CVE 2023-26369. And it's an out-of-bounds write issue that could lead to arbitrary code execution if exploited. Adobe is aware that the vulnerability has been exploited in the wild in limited attacks. So in turn, Adobe stamped the update with a priority of 1. That means it's the highest. And again, that it's very likely to be weaponized. Now, this is a popular product. I mentioned 0 days with some other, I would say, not as popular Adobe products, ones that I don't really come across all that often. When I talk to different members of industries like healthcare or healthcare financial services, since Adobe is typically used more for the creative side, Acrobat and Reader, it's not so much just used by, say, marketing or those that are designing materials like graphic designers. Acrobat and Reader can be used by anybody. So this is a very important update. Looking at who it affects, let's see, Acrobat DC versions 23 and earlier, as well as Acrobat 2020 and earlier. So that's pretty much everybody. If it happens to affect you, you have those products. I'm sure you do. Many have moved actually from Adobe over to Foxit Reader. In that case, not as big of a deal, but if you happen to be using those products, do make sure you update. Lastly, just to mention briefly, Adobe Experience Manager also received a lower priority 3 update to address 2 additional cross-site scripting issues, both rated as important, but only with CVSS scores of 5.4. Clearly between those 3 updates, Acrobat and Reader, again, are going to impact so many more users out there, including consumers. So if it happens to be you, make sure that you patch them. If you haven't already, of course, this was actually dropped again back on the 12th of September. Google Chrome has technically had 6 desktop releases. When I say technically, I'll elaborate on that a little bit. For Windows, Mac OS, and Linux in the month of September. However, literally hours after last month's webcast, and I gave everybody a disclaimer, it might happen, which it did, Chrome dropped another update just right after our last call on August 29th to resolve a single high severity bug tracked as CVE 2023-4572. It was a use after free issue immediate stream, but it did have a near critical CVSS score of 8.8. And it was actually reported on August 12th, so something that they took a little bit of time to resolve. At this time, the single researcher for that update has yet to have a determined bounty payout, which I always like to highlight those details, especially when it's a really crazy number. But whoever you are, I hope it's a good payout. It's yet to be determined. Moving on, our first September update dropped on September 5th and resolved 4 security issues, all rated as high severity. This included type confusion in the V8 JavaScript engine, use after free in networks, out of bounds memory access in FEDCM, and incorrect security UI in BF cache. 2 of these were both reported anonymously, and this release has also yet to have a determined amount for bug bounties. So once again, thanks for your research, and I'm hoping Google gives you some decent cash. About a week later, Chrome dropped a critical update on September 11th to resolve another 0 day related to heap buffer overflow in WebP. And you probably heard about this. This will give me the main topic of today's webcast. Tracked as CVE 2023-4863 and reported by Apple Security Engineering and Architecture and the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Monk School. This vulnerability affects the image compression library used in Chrome, as well as many other products. This includes other Chromium browsers like Edge, Opera, Vivaldi, Brave, hope I said those right, but also Mozilla Firefox, Thunderbird, Honeyview, Signal Electron, Affinity, GIMP, Inkscape, LibreOffice, Telegram, 1Password, among many other products. WebP is an image format that offers superior lossless and lossy compression for images on the web. Because of it, developers and webcasters have the ability to generate more compact, high-quality images, leading to significant performance and loading speed of most web pages. So it is a image format that you probably come across all the time, which means, of course, whatever products you're using to view it are probably affected by that vulnerability. I always like to bring this up when discussing Chrome, though, at least for the past few years, because it's been an interesting past few years since the pandemic started. Looking back, 2021 was a very tough year for Google, as the browser had 16 zero-day exploits, and in 2022 there were 9. With this latest 0-day, that puts Chrome at 4 0 days for this year. It's obviously looking much healthier than previous years, but again, we still have 3 months left, and I'm hoping that this is the last. If not, stick around. We'll be talking about on another webcast. Continuing on, the other big Chrome release for September dropped on the 12th to resolve a total of 16 security fixes, with 11 being disclosed by external researchers, including the 0-day from the day prior. They threw it into the next release as well. Fortunately, the rest of the security fixes for the 12th release are only medium and low severity issues, including inappropriate implementation and insufficient policy enforcement bugs. Google once again referenced the critical vulnerability, again being exploited in the wild, and forked out 18,500 US in bug bounties for the release. Another day later, on the 13th, Chrome dropped another special release for version 109 to provide extended support to Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 users, or I should say probably administrators. However, as mentioned in previous webcasts, they do plan to drop support by the end of next month. We'll circle back to that actually. Additional updates dropped on September 15th and the 21st. However, I don't have really anything to highlight. No fixes were disclosed in those releases according to their release notes. Every month I mention that Chrome is by far the most popular web browser, and that of course makes it a malicious attacker's preferred target. Regarding updating it, as always, the browser should auto-update for most consumers and users that have full control of their device, but administrators, do be sure to double check and update accordingly. Of course, a few weeks have gone by since that dreaded WebP vulnerability was disclosed, and of course we got updates for it as well, but do make sure you double check. Also remember that if you are still running Chrome on older versions of Server 2012 and R2, it is unsupported after October of this year. I'd recommend to ditch that browser actually as soon as possible and find an alternative before it's too late. Again, you pretty much have a month left. Following suit, any vulnerabilities resolved in Chrome also affect other Chromium-based browsers, and I always like to highlight Edge the most in this space when we're talking about derivatives. Edge received technically 9 updates since the month started. The September 7th release was to catch up with the 4 security fixes that Chrome received days prior. Then the WebP 0-day caused another rushed release on September 12th, followed by Edge's monthly feature release on September 15th. This update brought a few announcements, as well as 5 new features, 5 with a few more, I should say, 10 new policies, 2 deprecated policies, and an obsoleted policy. The first announcement is that Microsoft Edge for Business is now available for unmanaged Windows devices using Microsoft Intune mobile application management. However, support starts at Windows 11, 22, H2, or later, requires Intune 2309 or higher, and certain conditional access policy conditions must be met. If that interests you at all and you have those products and something that you want to get into for unmanaged assets, do make sure that you check the release notes. There are some more details about the conditional access policies. There are some caveats to it, which you may want to read up on. The other announcement is that the Chrome team plans to deprecate the unload event starting on Chrome version 118. It'll occur by gradually changing the default, so unload handlers stop firing on pages unless a page explicitly opts in to re-enable them, according to Microsoft's website, since of course following suit with Chrome. New features for Edge this month also include Edge for Business Banner with the promotional tabs enabled policy, Edge Sync Favorites recovery, autofill autocomplete to help fill form fields faster. Wow, can't say that too many times. Deprecation of Web Select to improve end user experience, and additional deprecation of Math Solver, Picture Dictionary, citations, grammar tools, and Kids Mode. Also, an additional Edge release dropped the same day to support Chromium 109, like mentioned earlier, on older systems. Like Chrome, it's intended for Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. However, good news if you have some other older systems. Microsoft will continue to support or extend Edge-specific, rephrase that. Microsoft will continue to extend Edge-specific support, there we go, to Windows 7, 8, and 8.1. Don't know how long it's going to last, actually. I would still recommend, if you're on those older systems, well, one, probably get off those older systems because they're not supported any longer. So we're talking about operating system patching. You're not really resolving much there, but as well, probably best to find another browser. Because if Chromium's not going to support it, well, you're then, just like the operating system, using 2 additional vulnerabilities. The rest of the month includes a few additional updates on September 19th, 22nd, 23rd, and 25th. However, none include any additional information. And fortunately, there were no Edge-specific vulnerabilities in any of the 9 Edge releases in September. That's usually why I talk about Edge, not just because it's just another browser and a popular one, but actually they do have Edge-specific vulnerabilities, even though it's based on Chromium or Chrome. It's a Chromium-based browser. They actually have some of their own that they will highlight, but none to highlight for this month. Given that multiple Edge releases resolve the WebP0 day and there were multiple feature changes to the browser, especially some that might interest you, and all of the Chromium other severity fixes still apply to Edge, I do strongly recommend to prioritize when you get a chance, if it hasn't updated itself already. This one, I kind of wrote a bit of this early, and this is where we're going to deviate a little bit today. Thought this was going to be a short slide, but actually has some more information. Didn't make it into the slide because it dropped right before I started the call. That's again a new update for Firefox. We'll go through this one, and then I'm actually just going to read directly from the release notes for today's call. The Firefox update dropped on the 12th and was pretty much just dropped to resolve the WebP vulnerability. It affected Firefox the same, even though it's not based on Chrome. It does use the same image format, so naturally the library was compromised. And just like pretty much every other browser out there you probably use, it required an update for the vulnerability. The 12th update for Firefox, bringing it to 117.0.1, did resolve 7 additional non-security bug fixes. And as well, if you happen to be using extended support release, it didn't apply to you. So we'll get to that in a second. There was another update just dropped today, and that brings Firefox actually to version 118, which if you are using ESR, you do get a new update as of today. There are some additional features, and I'm again winging it here, going through their release notes right now. Looking at Firefox 118 dropped today, there are some new features for automatic translation of web content. Web audio in Firefox now uses FD-LIBM, math library, to improve anonymity with fingerprint protection. Visibility of fonts has been restricted to system fonts. Video effects, Firefox, don't need to know about that. And then the security issues. So I'm going to go through these. Actually, this is mainly what I wanted to cover. Looking at the listing, there are 9 security fixes in the release just dropped today. Looking at the number of high severity ones, and again, I told you this is going to be a bit weird today. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them are rated as high, 1 as low, and 2 as moderate. Every single release of Firefox, we always see that there are memory safety bugs fixed, and it does always get a CVE, and it's always marked as high severity. The other ones include memory corruption. use after free, issues, memory leak from a privileged process, actually, out of bounds write and path ops, and out of bounds write and filter node D2, D1. So if you happen to be using Firefox, just make sure you update today. Not as critical as what we saw earlier this month with the WebP vulnerability, but you got a new release and it sounds like you got some new features that you might be interested in. It's oh, and I guess I should mention as well. Obviously, Firefox is not as popular to Chrome, popular as Chrome. But again, since they are security fixes and something I mentioned on previous webcasts, I love how Chrome or Firefox does, as a vendor, release all the detail about it. Probably because it's an open source project. I really do appreciate them as a vendor by releasing all the security information. I usually don't get that or see that out of many manufacturers. The next one, Notepad++, we do typically see. They will as well be just as transparent. Notepad++ dropped an update for the popular text and source code editor to resolve 4 separate security fixes. These are tracked as CVE 2023, 40031, 40036, 40164, and 40166. With the first one, 40031, having a higher CVSS severity of 7.8. The higher severity flaws related to heap buffer write overflow, and if exploited, could lead to arbitrary code execution. The lower severity flaws all have 5.5 ratings, and they're all pretty much related. Still technically global buffer read overflow or heap buffer read overflow, and if exploited, could all potentially actually lead to some other issue, leak internal memory allocation information. So I use Notepad++ all the time. It's better than Notepad on a Windows system. It's a much cleaner format. It has a lot of power in it. So if it is something that you use, it doesn't have an update mechanism or channel. So do make sure that you get the latest. It will perform a check. It will prompt you. Make sure that you actually agree to it and get the update delivered. Some additional products that have also seen updates since the start of the month include Bitwarden, Cisco products. Just like last month, they did actually have a CISA advisory, and there are many products to mention. So if you happen to be using any Cisco products, and that includes WebEx as well, I usually don't highlight on this slide, but there were a number of products with vulnerabilities. Dropbox, Foxit Reader, Genesis Cloud, not one that I typically discuss, but it was affected as well by the WebP vulnerability. iTunes, Jenkins, Malwarebytes, Power BI from Microsoft, Opera, again, another WebP victim, RingCentral, Skype, Slack, TeamViewer, WinSCP, WinSCP, and Zoom. And there are a few others as well, like mentioned earlier, that I didn't throw on this slide because I just mentioned them, like 1Password, GIMP, Inkscape. They all received updates as well due to the WebP vulnerability. My monthly reminder as well to all administrators, please incorporate third-party patching in your patch deployment process. Any and all applications can pose serious security risks, especially given that vulnerability for the image format issue present in most of the popular products. It probably affected pretty much everything out there. But before we go, bad news again for Apple users. September included a number of various releases for Apple products and included, sadly, multiple zero-day exploits once again. It's been a really bad year for Apple, actually. I appreciate that they're highlighting all the details on their site, but as well, allows us to see how many vulnerabilities are actually being discovered. But good to see as well that they're patching them. On September 7th, Apple disclosed CVE 2023, 41061, and 41064 regarding a wallet bug and image IO bug, respectively. If either are exploited, it may lead to arbitrary code execution. And again, these were actively exploited in the wild. The wallet bug affects watchOS, iOS, or iPadOS version 16, and the image IO bug affects iOS or iPadOS version 16, as well as macOS Ventura. A few days later, on September 11th, Apple continued to patch the image IO bug on macOS Big Sur and Monterey, as well as older iOS and iPadOS versions 15. Interestingly, these were all again reported by the Citizen Lab around the same time as the WebP vulnerability. After I did a little digging, since I thought that was way too much of a coincidence, it seems that the WebP vulnerability and the image IO bugs may actually be the same flaw. Hunting it off a certain site, Ben Hawks, previously with Google's Project Zero, stated that Image.io recently began to support WebP files and concluded that it seems likely actually are the same bug. So it's probably why we saw the increase with Apple as well, since of course for performance, they're definitely using that particular format on their systems, so they do appear to be related. On September 18th, Apple dropped another advisory for newer OS versions of tvOS 17, watchOS 10, and iOS and iPadOS version 17. However, only stated the details will be available soon. I didn't see it this morning, so still nothing to report. If you're an Apple user, you have an Apple fleet, probably just make sure, of course, if you see any updates available, that you agree. If you want to see what the details are, you can keep clicking on the website, click refresh all day. I wouldn't do it, but as soon as you see updates available, make sure you deliver them. Lastly, on September 21st, Apple updated 8 separate products for an additional 3 zero-day exploits tracked as CVE 2023, 41991, 41992, and 41993, dealing with security, kernel, and WebKit issues respectively. Not every product was affected by all 3, except for iOS and iPadOS versions 16.7 and earlier. They were affected by all 3. And that actually, I thought it was interesting. It actually was mentioned as well under the advisory for iOS and iPadOS 17, still saying that anything prior to 16.7 was affected. The rest of the products patched included macOS Monterey, Ventura, watchOS 9, as well as 10, iOS and iPadOS 17, like mentioned, and Safari. iOS specifically, not iPadOS, but just iOS 17 specifically had its own advisory for iPhone 15. However, it did not have any published CVE entries for this release. So that happens to affect. You might get an update, but it doesn't look like at this time that it's security related. Clearly, it was another bad month for Apple and some Apple users, unfortunately, who may have been exploited. Sorry. Fortunately, they are on top of their advisories, and like mentioned earlier, I do respect that they were pretty quick to provide a patch out to those systems. It's tough as a manufacturer when something is exploited, when there's a security issue, to highlight it or to say, we have new updates. But that's, of course, the only way to really resolve it. That's the best case, of course, for those situations. I know Apple doesn't really count as a third-party product, but I do like covering it on this webcast just to inform my audience, my Apple audience specifically, and especially with this month's theme clearly being zero-day exploits, of course, for any third-party products on Apple devices. Also be sure to check your App Store and update accordingly. There may be a few that are specific to Apple that I don't typically cover on these webcasts, but fortunately through the App Store channel, you should see them available and just click yes, update. I hope that this has been informative and useful to everybody. And if you enjoy the form of the webcast or not, please contact us and let us know. Every day, the Syxsense team identifies, classifies, and pre-checks various patches and vulnerabilities that affect common endpoints and servers. If you would like a full listing of all the various issues that may impact your environment, be sure to check our website under resources. You'll then see a link to the vulnerability database. What I love about the vulnerability library is that we not only discuss level of impact like everybody else out there, but we do offer recommendations and even resolutions to every issue with screenshots, step-by-steps, information to help you out. If you have any further questions or concerns or suggestions for improvement, especially for me, please don't hesitate. We would love to hear it. Thanks for your time and happy patching.